Hillary Clinton was on the Howard Stern show today, which was of great interest to me as a longtime observer of both Hillary Clinton and Howard Stern. And the interview was actually very good in the sense that it illuminated aspects of Hillary's personality and life experiences that you probably wouldn't get in really any other format. And so if you can separate your political views on Hillary from just the informative value of the interview, there was a lot to be gained from it. And it went, I think, over 2 hours. So there's a lot of material there. It mostly goes into her sort of backstory, how she met Bill. You can find clips online or listen to the whole thing on Sirius. I don't have a Sirius subscription, but somehow I'm able to listen to it on the online player. And Howard obviously greatly admires Hillary, which, if you followed his political evolution over the years, would not surprise you. Although in the 90s, Hillary was not somebody who Howard really much cared for, nor her husband, Bill, but Howard kind of developed a different kind of political persona than the one he originally had, which was sort of a quasi-libertarian, moderate Republican type. I mean, he ran for governor of New York briefly in 1994 as a libertarian, and he supported lots of Republican politicians over the years: Christine Todd Whitman, George Pataki, Chris Christie. But Hillary is somebody who he apparently likes, even though Donald Trump, as you probably also know, made many appearances on his show in the 90s and 2000s. So anyway, it's worth listening to, but there was a moment that stood out to me because it wasn't particularly informative in the way that I've just outlined, but it was still notable because the subject of Russian election interference came up, of course. Hillary is obviously very preoccupied with this still, is sounding the warnings to the current Democratic candidates about how deeply aware of this menace they need to be. And she just pretty much out of nowhere dropped this little dig at Bernie Sanders, essentially claiming that the Russians were attempting to elect Bernie in 2016. And then Howard gets her to comment on how she feels about Bernie and whether he was sufficiently supportive of her in the 2016 election. So let's hear that clip.
Do you just ever want to just lay in bed and say, fuck this, I'm getting out? I mean, I am going to go into full seclusion and they're never going to hear from me again.
No. First of all, that would only delight my adversaries. So I would never do that. But secondly, I have this unique perspective, some of which we've been talking about today. I have a unique perspective. I have a particular understanding of the Russian threat. And it's not going to only be Russia. I mean,
so you must be laying awake at night.
I do. I worry a lot.
Because you know what the shenanigans are.
Yes, I worry a lot.
You've negotiated with them. You've seen secret intelligence.
I have.
And you know that, there's these guys who phone from Nigeria who phone your home and somehow finagle $6,000 out of you by doing that.
Yeah.
And you're brilliant at it.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what's going on when Vladimir Putin sits there and plans against the United States.
Well, but you can read the indictments against the Russians. And a lot of people didn't pay attention to it, but it's very informative and scary.
Do you mean the Mueller report?
Yeah, the indictments.
Okay.
The report itself, I think, is also worth reading. But if you read the indictments, basically they were like, hey, let's do everything we can to elect Donald Trump. I mean, those are quotes.
Those are
taken.
words they
those
said.
are words that taken, and they also said Bernie Sanders, but that's another for another day.
Do we hate Bernie Sanders?
What?
Do we hate Bernie Sanders?
No, I don't hate anybody.
Bernie could have endorsed you quicker.
He could have. He hurt me. There's no doubt about it. He hurt me. But going back to the indictments, because that's what's really important.
Have you ever spoken to Bernie about that?
No.
You don't talk to him?
I don't talk to him. Yeah, I mean, we did when he finally endorsed me and all that.
But you're upset with him?
No, disappointed. Okay. So, and I hope he doesn't do it again to whoever gets the nomination.
Right.
Once is enough. We have to.
Everyone
things
unite.
are very
we have to
important right
join
now.
forces, and people could speculate and have some good reason to speculate about how bad it might be with Trump in the White House. Now we know there's no guesswork. We know, and we know that given his personality and his rage against anyone who questions him, Lord knows what he might try to do. So it's time to retire him.
So Hillary says she doesn't hate Bernie, but it's not hard to detect the slightly resentful tone when she discusses him. Notice she says they haven't spoken, apparently, since the 2016 campaign or thereabouts. And Hillary is convinced that Bernie hurt her words, by not endorsing her quickly enough in the 2016 campaign. Now, remember, Bernie ultimately did endorse Hillary once the voting was over and once the convention arrived. So it's not as though he went full Bernie or bust, as many of his supporters did. And in fact, a fair number of his supporters were not particularly thrilled with him endorsing Hillary, which, again, he ultimately did. And not only that, he traveled to 13 states and delivered 39 speeches on her behalf in the general election. So he was one of her most active surrogates. And yet, that's not enough for Hillary, apparently. She still has this disdain over her opponent having the audacity to see through that campaign in the primaries to completion. And it's kind of ironic because Bernie obviously did that because, in a way, he's always sort of been a consensus-oriented Democrat. That's not really the depiction of him that is predominant in the media, but, he's obviously taken on Democrats at times and been very critical of them. But at the end of the day, he's a member of the Democratic caucus in the Senate. He supported pretty much every Democratic presidential nominee. So it wasn't out of character for him to support Hillary in the general election in 2016. But none of that really redounded to his benefit politically. It's not as though you have diehard Hillary supporters or even Hillary herself giving him credit for what he did in the 2016 election. It didn't broaden really his appeal all that much. So maybe he would have been better off just not supporting her. It's kind of an open question. I guess you could make an argument that there are sections of the Democratic Party for whom the support of Hillary was actually pivotal in them now at least being open to him as the nominee in 2020. So it's sort of a mixed bag. But at least in sort of the narrative retelling of that time period, Hillary doesn't feel any obligation to assign Bernie credit at all. And notice what she said about him potentially not endorsing the 2020 nominee quickly enough. She says she hopes he doesn't do that same thing again this cycle. Well, what's the premise embedded in that statement? It's that she doesn't think he even has a possibility of winning the nomination because she's only thinking about him in terms of when he'll endorse, what the chronology of his endorsement will be. So it hasn't even occurred to Hillary that Bernie actually has a shot of winning the nomination in 2020, which he definitely does. And you can glean that simply by looking at the polling data. Obviously, it's going to be probably a close race, and nobody can really predict what's going to happen. But there's a very good chance that he could win at least a couple early primary states, particularly Iowa, New Hampshire, and maybe even Nevada. And that will be a springboard for him to contest through the rest of the primaries. So Hillary might be in for a rude awakening if she hadn't even given any thought to the notion that Bernie could possibly win the nomination. So that I thought was telling. But think about what she also did. I mean, this is probably the headline takeaway. She just threw in that little remark about how the Russians were working to elect Bernie in 2016. And what is that based on? I mean, she kind of gives this kind of cosmic importance to some throwaway lines in the Mueller report, which identified instances of Russian-backed entities putting out social media memes such as the infamous burning in a Speedo cartoon as indicating that the Russians were working to elect Bernie. Now, that's just a crock. We've been down this road so many times. The Russian troll farms, to the extent that they had any influence whatsoever in the 2016 election cycle, were mostly about clickbait. They mostly had a commercial incentive so that they just wanted to throw anything out there that could generate clicks and therefore economic benefit to them. And the idea that there were hordes of voters who were swindled into supporting Bernie and or Trump by these memes is a nice story that Hillary could tell to herself, because obviously she doesn't think that she was at all responsible for her loss in 2016. Even still, she still blames it in the interview on Russia, on Comey, etc. It's getting tedious at this point to hear her characterize all that. But if Bernie does get into serious contention in 2020, which he probably will, or there's at least a good chance that he will, expect this attack to be resurrected, whether by Hillary herself, her surrogates, her proxies. We know that in the wake of her Tulsi dispute, Tulsi responded by telling her to enter into the arena and not rely on her proxies to wage war against her, which she kind of had been. Tulsi didn't come up in this interview, which obviously was a little disappointing, because that would have been interesting to hear Hillary elaborate on that episode, but I wouldn't have expected really Howard to bring that up. But this was an interesting interview and illuminating for reasons having to do with just the fact of Hillary being a significant political figure, and hearing her kind of describe some of her experiences was illuminating, just if you're a student of American politics, or if you're interested in how our country is governed. But also that line, I thought, was indicative of an attack on Bernie that's almost inevitably going to come up again, depending on how the primary season transpires. So that'll do it for now. Have a wonderful day.